Berlin. In Berlin, just after the war, I occupied the house of a family who had all disappeared. After a while, though I used their things, slept in their beds, ate at their table, and examined their photos, I came to think of the house as mine, and I was surprised, shocked even, when I was finally forced to accept the fact that it was I who had been the intruder all along. I found the apartment on one of my long walks around Berlin after the fall, after the Russians had been dispatched to the east, after the Americans set up camp. There were many apartments like the one I had come to think of as mine, though most of them were locked, keeping the secret of death inside. My place, however, was wide open, as if begging for companionship. One would think during such a time when our world had been turned upside down that the neighbors would have helped themselves to the contents of the apartment, but as far as I could tell, everything was just as the rightful occupants had left it, though I never found any money or jewelry. Perhaps they had taken that with them. In the beginning, before I met Leo and Isaac and still had the apartment to myself, I was always half waiting for the rightful occupants of the apartment to return. "Who are you?" they might have asked. "I've been taking care of your apartment," I would have said, and we would have introduced ourselves, and they would have invited me to stay for supper, though I would have insisted on preparing it. The supper would have been light because they would have been tired. Eggs and bread, some cheese, perhaps, tea. And then they would have thanked me and told me to visit again soon, and I would have found myself outside in the cold with no place to go. But they did not return, and I was relieved, though I tried not to think about the fact that I was, because it was obvious then that they had died, either in the air raids or worse yet, when the Russians entered Berlin. For the first few weeks, I disturbed as little as possible. I slept on the floor in the kitchen on a pallet made from extra blankets I had found in the closet. I used only one dish, one fork, one knife, one spoon, one cup. I emptied out the ashtray after each cigarette. I dusted the family photographs, the father in uniform, the wedding portrait, the boys. There were two children, two boys who, judging from their toys, had a fondness for automobiles. But after a while, I did not think so much about the apartment's previous inhabitants. I started rearranging things to suit my needs. I threw away their toothbrushes. Still, I slept on the floor in the kitchen next to the radiator, where it was the warmest. I found that I liked sleeping on the floor. It made me feel as if I were accomplishing something. I think I believed that sleeping on the floor was making me strong, building up my endurance, as if I were training for a very difficult future. It was a terrible winter, the winter of 1945. If I believed in God, I would have had to believe that God felt we had not been punished enough, that we needed more battering, more misery for our uncountable sins, and that the winter of 1945 was that punishment. But at least it was quiet. Some would have said deathly quiet. The bombed out buildings, the snow, the hunched citizens in frayed coats, clutching bags of potatoes and carrots, more snow. When the war was finally over and we knew that we were among the living, it was the quiet that saved us from despair. I walked for hours from one end of our bombed out city to another, avoiding human contact. I had spent too much time huddled close together with my parents and neighbors in the bomb shelter. When it was finally over, I did not want to sit in our unbombed apartment and talk about the future. And what was the future? My father's typewriter business would be resuscitated, of course. My father had his plans. The American Army would need typewriters. An army needs typewriters. That my father knew. He had not done badly during the war. In fact, at the end of the war, there were no typewriters left in the warehouse, though they had not all been sold. The Nazis had confiscated what was left towards the end, melted them down for the final effort. I was the one who supervised the confiscation, writing down all the serial numbers so, as my father insisted, there would be a record. I don't know whether my father expected to be reimbursed at some point or whether he simply could not give up his meticulous business practices just because bombs were flying and the Soviet army had reached our borders. When I was 6, my father taught me how to type. Every evening for an hour and for 2 hours on Sunday afternoons, I was forced to practice so that by the time I was 12, I was a prodigy. 120 words a minute without one mistake. My fingers flew across the keyboard as quickly in French or English as they did in German. Once I heard my mother brag about my typewriting abilities. She was having coffee and pastries with one of the neighbors, and I was just about to enter the living room to ask whether I could have a pastry too. "My daughter is a typing genius," she said proudly, and I ran back to my room and cried for a full hour. I remember thinking that if this was my greatest accomplishment, then I might as well throw myself in front of a streetcar. Though I was a quiet child, I was prone to such melodramatic outbursts. But after the war, whether it was due to the war itself or simply to maturity, I no longer let myself indulge in such childish thoughts. My mother was much younger than my father. She was British from a dreary town in northern England and had met my father when he was working in London for some kind of shipping company. We visited her hometown and my maternal grandparents only once. My grandparents lived above the dress shop that they owned. The house was damp and cold, even in April, which was the time of our visit. We went to church on Easter Sunday, and my grandfather came home drunk late that night. In the morning, he didn't get up to open the dress shop, and my grandmother was crying, and my mother held her hand, and my father shook his head. On this visit, my grandparents paid me very little attention. I only remember my grandmother asking me whether I liked school. I answered in the affirmative because I could sense that she was not interested in my true feelings about the matter. At one point, when we were in the middle of dinner and I asked politely for the salt, my grandmother said I was very sweet. I think I can safely say that this is the only time in my life when anyone has ever had such thoughts about me. My grandfather was even more aloof. When I looked in his direction, he turned away, as if he believed that by doing so, he would become invisible. Perhaps he did this with everyone, but I was too young to make a study of him. In 1944, my maternal grandparents were killed by German bombs. Upon receiving the telegram, my mother cried for 5 or 10 minutes, and then she stopped abruptly, dried her eyes, got up, and announced that she was going to take a walk. Once she was gone, I regretted not having made any attempts to comfort her. So to make up for this deficiency, I tried very hard to cry, but was unsuccessful. After this failed attempt, I could not bring myself to pick up a book or turn on the radio, so I waited without rising. When the room grew dark, I did not turn on the lights. So when my mother returned soon after nightfall with a box of eclairs, the first thing she did was turn on the lights. "There, that's better," she said, as she began setting the table with a good lace white tablecloth and good silver. She arranged the eclairs carefully on her best Delft platter, and then we sat down to eat. We ate them all, 3 each, slowly and carefully, savoring every bite, not speaking.